Hello, everyone. Welcome to Triennale Decameron. Today, my name is Paola Nicolin. I'm a curator of the public program at Triennale Milano. And today, we are gonna talk with the Metropolitan Museum of our director, Max Hollein, the 10th director of the institution. So we are going to be connected with him and recording the interview. So let me keep a few minutes for waiting for him to accept the invitation. And then we will start the conversation. Just in the form of introduction, I can give you a few records of the brilliant career of Max Hollein. Max Hollein grew up in Austria in a cultural milieu. His father was the legendary postmodern architect Max Hollein. Her mother is a fashion designer, and he studied art history, is an art historian and a museum manager. He actually got her first job in New York at the Guggenheim Museum, where he was chief of the staff at Thomas Crane's director. Then he moved back to Europe, where he directed for 15 years 3 museums in Frankfurt, the Schrein-Kunsthalle, the Stedter Museum, and the Liebighaus. And then he came back to the US, directing for a couple of years the San Francisco Fine Art Museum before accepting the role of director of the Metropolitan Museum. So he has a strong background in both European and US museum management, as an art historian, as a curator, and as a museum manager. So now I'm admitting Max Hollein, and he should be very soon online with us. Hello, good morning.
Good morning, Paola. How are you?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you well, yes.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much for joining Triennale today.
Sure, I'm sorry that it didn't work out the last time.
Yeah, but you know, the streaming, it's a little bit complicated, especially with the long distance calling. So it's happened, and I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk to you in this more settled situation.
Okay.
So I've already anticipate few records about your career, so we can move directly to some question I'd like to address to you.
Okay.
On this occasion. Well, you are directing the probably the most encyclopedic museum of the world since 2 years, not since 2019. You accepted the director of the role of director of the Metropolitan, and I would like to start from this probably huge but also very interesting question in terms of your vision. What is an encyclopedic museum today? It's something that you can describe as of course a complex machine, but with a kind of software power to a certain extent. Well, how would you define, let's say in 5 years, the encyclopedic museum like the Metropolitan?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that need to be said about that. One is I clearly see an encyclopedic museum, a museum that's really about the world, but also for the world, is now and these days more relevant than ever. I think we are all experiencing and have already experienced in the past probably years a tendency towards an increased amount of nationalism in various countries. And I think during this time of crisis and during the health crisis and coronavirus, you see even more nationalism popping up. So with everybody kind of closing their borders, being closed at home, I think it's now more important than ever to know that there are institutions that are really go beyond borders and that are about a global understanding and a global experience, a communal experience in that sense. So I think the relevancy of that type of a museum is absolutely important. I would argue, though, that the idea of the encyclopedic museum has certainly changed in the last, let's say, 200 or 250 years. So it came out of the idea came out of the age of the Enlightenment, right? And so in a very simplified way, the ideology was bring all the cultures of the world to one place. And then museums tend to tell one more or less linear story about cultural development. So it usually starts in old Mesopotamia and then goes to Egypt, then to Greece, then to Rome, and then it's kind of very Europe-centered. And we have to see that today there is this one linear narrative is wrong. It's not only too Western or Euro-centered. There is actually not one narrative. There are in fact multiple interconnected subjective narratives that we need to make more transparent. So the Encyclopedic Museum is not only an encyclopedic museum about a multitude of objects, but the Encyclopedic Museum of the Future is also encyclopedic in regard to its multitude of narratives that it provides, its multitude of parallel and intersecting narratives. So it will become a more subjective institution as such, but it is, on the other hand, an institution where you can access, coming from wherever you come, to your own way of looking at it, and then finding these connectors. So I think that's a seismic shift in regard to how encyclopedic museums operate. The second piece of that is, of course, that a museum, as we all know, is not only a place that you visit. It is first and foremost, but it's not only a place that we visit. Museum as an idea or as almost like a task goes way beyond that. It has a major educational task. It has a public task. It is a task of outreach. So for the Encyclopedic Museum of the Future, it is more and more relevant to be accessible all around the world. And that always, of course, means further enhancing our digital platforms and our outreach, and being present in these various different cultures as well as a participant in the dialogues that are happening all around the globe.
Yeah, but that's definitely the topic, or at least the supposed title of the conversation, that is the idea of sharing, the idea of accessibility of data. And you mentioned, I take the example of this huge anniversary that you are celebrating right now, because the 13th of April was the big birthday of the museum, and of course it was on your agenda since the very beginning, but dramatically there was no virus on your agenda. So it's probably an historical, dramatic and terrible event, but it is an historical event. The fact that you are celebrating 150 years of the museum in a global pandemic. And I've listened to some of your recent interviews before the emergency, and I'd like to ask you about, I mean, how you did, you still do manage this tragic coincidence, but also in terms of how you did conceive the exhibition of Making the Met, and how you enforce the digital accessibility to the public in this situation.
Well, a couple of things that need to be said about that. Obviously, we prepared for our 150th anniversary in the last 2 years, and we were planning to celebrate not only on that day, on April 13th, but throughout the year. Yeah. So in a certain way, we are or were filled up to the brim with programming for the entire year. And of course, now we are closed. We have been closed for now 7-8 weeks, and we had to completely change and transform. Also, I would say our focus has changed. Now is not a moment for us to celebrate. It's not a moment for us to even focus that much on our institutional history. For us, in the first couple of weeks, it was, first of all, it was a matter of being very responsive and responsible about the safety of our staff and our visitors. The Met was actually the first cultural institution in New York City to close. And there was no governmental mandate for doing so. We decided ourselves to do that. Obviously, it had a trickle-down effect for all of New York City then. But so it was on the one hand being a responsible institution. Now, being in this crisis, it also means being very responsive to a lot of the challenges that we have, making sure that our staff is not only safe, but that we also create a more sustainable future for our institution when we reopen. And now, and then coming into the whole question of programming, of course, we had to change our programming. I wanted to make sure that a lot of the work that we have done on major exhibitions, especially like making the Met, about the history of the Met, it can be perceived by our audiences, also physically. So yes, we surfaced a lot of digital programs that are accessible right now about that, but we wanted to make sure that an exhibition like this can be seen by our audiences physically. So we moved all of that kind of programming into the fall, changed our entire exhibition calendar. The exhibition on Making the Met is in that sense also really important because it on the one hand shows you an exhibition about the development of the Met as an encyclopedic institution, but it also is in a certain way also a history of New York City in the last 150 years. I need to almost like remind our viewers that the Met was founded 150 years ago, that's true, but very different to an Italian museum. At the time of its founding, it has had nothing. It had not a single work of art, not a building, and actually no money. There was only this typical New York ambition of a couple of people saying, okay, we want a big encyclopedic museum in New York City. So that kind of the last 150 years are also a history about the ascent of New York City and about the ambition of New York City. And to a certain extent, and I think that's especially relevant for our subject right now, the resilience of New Yorkers and New York City. So we all know, also after this crisis, New York will resurrect, and there will be a different New York maybe, but a very powerful New York. And we have also, this institution went through different crises, the Great Depression, 9/11, many other things. So that's also what this exhibition tells you as well, although when we planned it, we were not anticipating our current moment. So it's an important show to be sharing with audiences when we can invite everyone back in the summer and the fall.
Yeah, yeah. I'd like to move to the role of contemporary art at the Metropolitan, but just before, in Italy is probably stronger than other museums like yours that has already thousands and millions of followers. But in this moment of crisis, we have seen a massive amount of open data and projects online. And besides the quality and quantity, maybe we can discuss it in another interview, but the topic is, do you think that it is interesting to discuss or to think about how a follower could be transformed into a visitor? Because it doesn't seem that this is not a kind of effect, because it doesn't mean that being a follower, being someone who's every day is clicking on Instagram and or other social media means that you come to the museum. This is probably not necessarily a topic for the Met, which has different numbers, but I think it's a topic for an encyclopedic museum, or at least for museum manager, how to let's say, take advantage of this kind of interest in museum. I was speaking with an artist yesterday about this conversation, and he told me the Met saved my life during the quarantine, because I spend my days in reading thousands of pages of the library, and which is one of the millions of projects you have been doing since, I mean, before the virus, of course. But so how a follower could become a visitor, or is it possible in your opinion?
Yes. So let me say this. The Met has a very robust and very multifaceted digital offering and various platforms, social media, websites, etc. We also have an enormous amount of information, not only online, but really also organized in a way that you can really use it for your scholarly purposes, or just by just being as a leisure activity. We have 1,700 publications online for free, accessible from the Met. We probably have one of the deepest art history online learning tools at the Met, the so-called timeline of art history. We have all sorts of other things there. So I think on the one hand, our digital platforms really fulfill also a core mission of the institution, which is really a provider of educational information, of content, of ways to be engaged with. Having said that, though, I think that I see the physical visit to a museum as only a part of how you can be engaged with an institution, with a museum. So basically, there is a moment how you can prepare for it beforehand, and after you visit, there are ways how to stay engaged with the institution afterwards. So in my sense, the digital experience and the physical experience of a visit is merging more and more, not in the sense that you run around at the museum with an iPad or an iPhone, but actually that the idea of a visit and the idea of experiencing art in real and reflecting on it, that can be extended after you visit through digital platforms, or you can have a richer experience coming to our museum if you use some of our digital tools beforehand. So I don't see them in competition at all. I see them as really complementary. And on the other hand, as said, the Met is an encyclopedic museum. So it is really also a museum for the world. And I know, I mean, we have over 7 million visitors currently, but there are many, many, many more visitors who can't physically visit us because of sheer distance and other elements. So we want to make sure we are there for them as well, because we are really a global institution for a global audience.
And do you think that this could be also a form of sustainability for the museum? I mean, it's maybe this crisis again is an opportunity to discuss a different model of museum management, which is, of course, in Italy or in Europe, more based on public investment or ticketing. In the US, it's completely different situation. But the question of the audience is a kind of share topic, So that is quite interesting. And the idea of this educational task that could be a kind of sustainability model for the future, especially for this sort of fragility of mobility and difficulties in let's say ancient idea of the visit of a museum as a kind of first step into the art. So that's why before I was referring to the role of contemporary art, because at the very beginning, when you talk about the encyclopedic and the idea of enlarging narrative, is a matter of fact that when you arrive at the Met, you start rethinking about the collection display, the programming towards diversity, women artists, and many, many other aspects. But which is the role in this perspective of contemporary art? I mean, how contemporary art, which is present, we know the Breuer building, so there is a kind of line out in the museum, but in the imaginary of the Met is encyclopedic, so it's not the museum that necessarily dedicated to contemporary art, but it has been very, very important, the role of contemporary, at least as a visitor. I make an example very simple. I visited the museum when I was a kid, and 2 years ago, I came with one of my kids, and he say, "Mommy, on the roof of the Met, there are aliens there." So I think it's also a kind of, new public, new idea of which is the audience of the museum. But again, are contemporary at the Met? This is the question.
So contemporary art has always been part of the Met. The founders of the museum, some of them were contemporary artists. The Met has always collected the art of its time. I would say in any other city than New York and maybe Paris, the Met's collection of contemporary art would be the best contemporary and modern contemporary art collection in the city. It just so happens that in New York there are some other great institutions for modern contemporary art. So that's why often the question comes up, so what is modern contemporary art at the Met? And I think it's really important that the Met has not only that strong collection, but actually it puts modern and contemporary art in the context of art history, but also in the context of a broader cultural understanding of what the art of the 20th century is. I would challenge you actually by saying, go through even our to our galleries of African art right now. You would be surprised how many of these objects are actually from the 20th century. It's just our sometimes Western trained eye doesn't actually recognize them as contemporary or 20th century artworks. So I think it's, for the Met, it's important to broaden your understanding about modern contemporary art, like in regard to where it comes from and what it means. It's important to broaden your understanding how the art of the current time connects with the art of the past, and that's also what's important. And then I think that I'm a great believer, of course, in contemporary art and artists being not only seismographs, but really being able to lead also us as an institution towards what's important. So hence we have further amplified and I would say expanded our way of engaging contemporary artists with the Met and in very public areas of the Met. As examples, inviting Wangechi Mutu, Kenyan sculptor and painter, to do sculptures on the facade of the Met. Inviting Kent Monkman, a Cree native artist from Canada, to do two major new history paintings about an alternative history of Native Americans, and so on. So I think you see that also contemporary art actually at the Met can be sometimes bolder and more playful than in a classical, modern, and contemporary art institution. And I think that's also what artists are gravitating towards. If you would ask a lot of artists in New York City what's their favorite museum, they probably say the Met. And if you ask them where would they love to exhibit, it's also probably the Met, because they like that context. They like also that these are not neutral spaces. They are very charged. It's a very charged environment. It's a challenging environment, both the public spaces as well as our other galleries. And I think that there is something there that kind of sparks not only the audience imagination, but also an artistic process that can be very healthy for the artistic production, but actually also for the institutional development.
Yeah. And in overlappings of chronology and on the idea of the museum as a producer of art, I mean, it's as something where you go, but also you produce the plans for the modern wings. I know that this is a crisis moment, so everything is iced, but it's something that is continuous, at least in the form of a vision of the museum, the David Chipperfield new wing dedicated, or at least devoted to, I presume, this kind of interference between modern contemporary art at the museum. Something's going on.
Yeah, we are very committed to our plans and our way of finding an amplified and improved way about how to display our great collections of modern and contemporary art, and how to best connect it actually also within the overall structure and fabric of the institution. So for sure, our plans for the modern wing are continuing. Having said that, we all know this is a new challenge, or let's say a new environment that we are going to venture into with a lot of I would say variables that we have not yet even identified yet. So we'll move forward, but will be, of course, to a certain extent flexible and responsive. But I see the current crisis really more as a set of really challenges that we have to overcome. I know that there are some opportunities embedded in this, but I see less opportunities. I see right now challenges that we will work through, but we have long-term plans for the institution. We had them before, we continue to have them, and we will have them in the next couple of years. We will come back to maybe it's not the same as before, but we will come back to a system that will help the institution further evolve, and the modern contemporary art will certainly be part of that.
Yeah. This is, I mean, I'm sure that on this, during the streaming there had been a question about the fact that the Met at the moment is, as far as I know, the only museum, let's say in New York, that still that didn't, let's say, fire or stop any contract in terms of employee. And I received a question about, is there any specific measure, or do you think that in the next future for the sustainability of the museum, the Met is gonna work in specific direction? I'm asking you these things because I think that your European experience, which is, I think, very rare, the fact that you have both grew up in a museum context in Europe and in US, probably is a kind of how can I say, a DNA that is pushing you to overlap the difficulties comparing different models of managing, you know. So, and also, I mean, sorry, but the question is regarding that topic.
So to address your question first in general, and then I'll talk about the Met in specific terms. Certainly during this crisis, you see a difference in regard to American institutions and European institutions, a difference that's basically based on institutions that are being run as private foundations, being privately funded, versus European institutions which are mainly being funded by through public support. So you see a certain time lag right now in regard to reacting to the crisis. American institutions need to react to it very swiftly because they're seeing the results of the crisis immediately, not only because they're losing all the ticket revenues, but also because philanthropy, which is the main pillar of the funding, is changing immediately, right? European institutions who support more governmental funding, that's not going to be cut. That's currently not being cut immediately. But in European institutions, you will see the result of the economic crisis maybe in a year or two in the stronger terms, because governments will probably kind of reevaluate how much public spending they can do, etc. So there's a difference in pace and timing here, but we're all facing the same issues for sure. In regard to the Met and during our current crisis, we have calculated that we will lose during this current time of closure and right after we want to reopen between $100 and $150 million, which is a massive and significant amount. And we had to find ways how to compensate for that in the short term and in the longer term. And which basically meant we had to reallocate certain funds from endowments that we could use to support operations. We've asked our donors and trustees to support us, and we needed to reduce programming in that context. We are also, though, need to model our institution towards a different environment in the next couple of years when we reopen. It is obvious that international tourism will be so significantly down, as in New York City for sure, for actually quite some time. And international tourists make up 30% of our visitors. We also anticipate in the next couple of years a different kind of philanthropic environment, again, because donors might actually support a little bit less museum exhibitions. They might support more social causes in an economic crisis, and I think that's right. It's good to do for them to do that. So yes, the institution needs to shrink to a certain extent, modestly, but we wanted to make sure that our staff, all of our staff, permanent and part-time, front line staff, and everyone else, is safe and paid for during this time of closure, even if they simply cannot work right now, not even from home. And so we've committed to paying everyone until early July, and are currently looking through what measures do we need to take in the longer term to do that. I mean, and to accommodate the necessities of this realignment.
Yeah, yeah. That's a good message, even from this side of the ocean, which probably we don't have an endowment, but definitely we need to shrink and to think about how to rebirth the strategy in a different way. So we are almost arriving to our 30 minutes conversation, so it's literally 30 seconds more. And honestly, with this positive message, I would like to conclude, because it's the best conclusion we could have. I officially invite you to Triennale Milano, not only for visiting the city you know very well, but because you know that we have in our archive a wonderful documentation of your father exhibition in 1968, and so maybe it's a good opportunity to have a coffee together in a real space and not only in virtual. I really thank you very, very much. Indeed, it was really a pleasure and honor. And enjoy the rest of your day, and hope to see you in person very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you, Paola. It's great to talk to you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.